what you believe is what you think God believes. And it's just utterly brilliant research. They manipulated your belief, and basically it was, if you changed your mind on a subject, lo and behold, God changed his mind as well.
Wow.
And it's just a fascinating study that shows that what we think God thinks or believes is a projection of our thoughts and beliefs.
That is a fun intro. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, that took me, I kid you not, that took me like 5.5 hours.
Oh, I was going to guess much more than that. Like, that's impressive work. Well done.
I think total, if I had to count like collecting all the clips and things like that, probably a lot more. But the actual putting everything together, very long time.
Yes,
very long
I
time.
believe that. Like that was, I know what goes into that kind of thing. It's like, well done.
So you liked it? You felt honored by that? You feel like it's worth?
Okay, dancing?
Cool.
I was up here dancing. Love it.
I wanted to make sure that you felt like we're going hard for Dr. Bird. Like we're throwing it down. I love it. I bet you've never had a theme song like that, huh?
Nice. Well, so I mean, full disclosure, David McDonald made me a personal theme song, and
his are good actually. His are top tier. So I mean, for one of our streams, I actually sent him this song, and I said, "You need to play this the next time I'm on your show." And he's like, "Oh yeah, done." Yeah. Well, listen, if I got to be second to anybody, I'm glad it's David McDonald over at Deep Drinks. Everybody, go check out after this, not during this. David McDonald on Deep Drinks.
What's the longest you've gone without sleep? I love that you don't know.
I don't.
I respect that.
Listen,
you gotta think about that.
Listen, I have a past.
Yep, I can tell already.
Almost, I want to say almost 72 hours.
Ooh.
Could be 72, but I don't think so.
Sometimes it's just the way that they talk about the church up the street.
Literally.
Those guys and the way they're doing things, you don't want to be part of. And every other church except for ours is doing it wrong. And
yes. Yeah, I told Vince, you're almost better off being an atheist than being the wrong kind of evangelical Christian. You're almost more salvageable not believing in God at all than being a Presbyterian or a Methodist. And I would love to just hear your experience. I would love to just understand more about what that's like and what we can learn and your thoughts and anything else you got.
Sure. Well, there's a lot, as you might expect.
I would imagine.
I'm not even sure where to begin. In the humanist space, the skeptic space, people are mostly on board with broad acceptance of LGBTQIA+, etc. There are a few notable exceptions, but most people see humanism is a value, and so accepting people for who they are is part of that, and that's not
the whole thing. Yeah. That's the first theme song that ever went as it was supposed to go. I'm so excited that worked.
Great.
Dr. Wathey, thank you so much for joining me. It's so great to have you back on the channel. I know you've been a guest at this point probably 4 times.
I can't remember, but
yeah, at
glad
least
to be
4
back
times.
again.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I know people were really looking forward to hearing this talk of yours. But enough from me. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
Well, I'm a computational biologist by profession. I'm retired now, been doing other things for the last few years. My scientific work was mostly involved in predicting structures of proteins, which is a bit obscure. And the problem I was working on, by the way, has now been solved by artificial intelligence. So
That's amazing.
My approach didn't work out too well, but that's another story. When it wasn't working out so well, I turned my interests and attention to something that had been in the back of my head for a long time, which is trying to make sense of religion. Where does religiousness really come from? And I've written 2 books about that. We will not be talking about much of that today, although we'll touch on some of the ideas a little bit when the subject of cults comes up in this talk. But most of the talk is something different, having to do with a pressing emergency that our country faces.
Awesome. And I will say, even if you're not talking about your book, on day 1, Dr. Andy Thompson went off about your book. He just told everybody about your book, to the point where I had to link his book too, because I was like, he also has a book, but he told everybody to buy your book. So hopefully you see just a hike in sales. But well, excellent. If it's all right with you, then I'll go ahead and pull up the presentation and we can just go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
And,
So,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to tell anybody in the chat, whoever has questions for Dr. Wathey, I'm going to be collecting them all throughout the presentation, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterward. So please spam the chat with all of your questions. And with that, perfect. It is all you.
Okay. Now, this talk is very slide intensive, so all the folks in the audience should pay attention to the slides as best as you can. I'll try not to put you to sleep. Okay, can science save us from Trumpism? I know that title may seem strange. Science is a tool for discovering how reality works, not for changing the minds of voters. But science can help us understand that the power that Donald Trump has over his voters, why reason and evidence fail to change their minds, and how we might fix the defects in our electoral system that enabled the rise of Trumpism. Here's a quick outline of the talk. In part 1, I'll say a little bit about how I got interested in this subject. I will then summarize the dire problem our nation faces, cast in the form of an open letter to my pro-Trump friends.
Interesting.
In part 2, I'll shine the light of science on a dark mystery. By what power does Donald Trump seduce his followers? In part 3, I'll explain how our broken electoral system enabled the rise of Trumpism, and how science and math can help us fix it. This is a long-term fix that will take years, and we must do it. But we also face a desperate situation right now. And so in part 4, I'll make an urgent plea for help, cast as an open letter to my anti-Trump friends. So that's the map of where we're going. Now on to part 1. As some of you may know, and as I was just mentioning, I write books about religion. So why am I talking about Trumpism and electoral reform? Like most Americans, I grew up with the comforting illusion that our democracy works fairly well. And back in 1960, it seemed to. But half a century later, one election in particular would shatter that illusion. This image was taken at a public viewing of a presidential debate in October of 2016. A poll taken 6 weeks earlier found that these 2 candidates were essentially tied as the 2 least popular presidential candidates in polling history. 60% of registered voters rated them unfavorable. That means at least 10% of voters, possibly more, disliked both candidates.
Wow.
Which says to me that the nomination process had failed. Somehow it had ignored most voters. It was this election, especially the defective nomination process, that got me interested in electoral reform. During that primary season, I wrote an article about it, and I got an intriguing reply from a clever man named Danny Kleinman, shown here on the left when we later met in person. Danny is a world-class bridge player and an expert on other intellectually demanding games like chess and backgammon.
Interesting.
He's also a very talented mathematician with a lifelong interest in the mathematics of voting systems. He truly opened my eyes to the flaws in our electoral system. I'll have more to say about his ideas later in the talk, but right now I just want to make it absolutely clear that when I say our electoral system has defects, I am not talking about voter fraud. We have good safeguards against that in our country. And more specifically, Biden and Harris won the 2020 presidential election fair and square. This is not a partisan opinion. It is an empirical fact, documented by meticulous record keeping under the eyes of election observers, verified by audits and recounts, certified as accurate by local election officials of both parties, and so ruled by numerous judges, including Supreme Court justices, who rejected Donald Trump's frivolous claims to the contrary. Even so, those false claims have caused a lot of damage. Now, 4 years later, we face a far more dangerous situation. Donald Trump arguably poses the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War.
Wow.
Yet, he would be powerless without his tens of millions of followers. This particular one holds a sign that is especially puzzling because Trump's fans are neither silent nor a majority. But they are, however, completely under his spell. I have tried and failed to break that spell. For the last 8 years, mostly through Facebook, I have reached out to friends and family members who sincerely believe that Trump is the greatest president in American history. I have patiently pointed out his dishonesty, personality flaws, dubious history as a businessman, high crimes and misdemeanors, and above all, his disloyalty to the Constitution, all with essentially no effect. Now, I doubt that any Trump supporters, including those who know me, will even watch this talk. But in the hope that a few might, and to set the stage for the rest of the talk, I will now read an open letter to my pro-Trump friends. Some of you are family, others classmates from long ago, but we all love America, and that's what motivates my letter. I'm writing out of both hope and despair. For years, I have reached out to you on Facebook, trying not only to understand your movement, but also to save you from the grip it has on your minds, to open your eyes to reality. I imagine you bristling with rage at that last sentence, angry at what you take as condescension and insult. And I know I sometimes come across that way, and I'm sorry if I've offended you, but that was never my intent. As a caring friend, I'm only trying to tell you the truth about your idol. Donald Trump is not the Christ-like, self-sacrificing savior of America you imagine him to be. He is not the confident, swaggering strongman descending the golden escalator. He is not the conquering hero depicted in your favorite memes. He's not the godly Christian you want him to be, and he's not even the conservative you think he is. Before the rise of Trumpism, the conservative movement in America had guiding principles and virtues, things like being honest with yourself and others, being gracious in defeat and humble in victory, admitting mistakes and trying to learn from them, making big changes in small steps to avoid making big mistakes, living within your means, both as individuals and as a nation, and fostering cooperation among all citizens for the good of the country. Now, of course, there's more to conservatism than just this, but I've emphasized these aspects because I happen to agree with them. That's why I call myself a left-leaning centrist rather than a liberal, and why I'm certainly not the Marxist, communist, or radical leftist you often call me in our conversations. Pejoratives you surely are parroting from your leader, Donald Trump. But the main reason I've called your attention to this list is that these virtues are the antithesis of Trump. Not only is he incapable of these, he personifies their exact opposite. Of course, you will deny this, and I don't have time to make the case for all of them. So let's just focus on the last one. Fostering cooperation among all citizens for the good of the country.
The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
Trump has a long history of language that incites and demonizes.
Yes.
How can you seriously claim that Trump tried to unite Americans as president?
No, not at all.
He deliberately demonized anyone who opposed him, and he still does it today. In doing so, he has brought out the worst in you, turning you against your friends, neighbors, and family. By dividing us, he has weakened America in a way no other president has done, much to the delight of our adversaries. And the saddest part is that he did all this, excuse me, he did all this merely to enrage you, his followers, to pump up your loyalty to him. That's all he cares about, himself. Not you, not America, not the border wall, not the rule of law, not the Constitution, not democracy, only himself. That's why he couldn't admit to being a loser in November of 2020, why he fabricated that big lie about the election being stolen.
Right.
And why he incited a mob to storm the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. Since then, both he and you have spun wild conspiracy theories to cling to this lie and avoid facing a painful truth. This is why I claim there is nothing conservative about Trump or Trumpism. So if this is not conservatism, then what is it? Well, we have a word for authoritarian movements that try to seize power through violence and threats of violence.
Oh.
Fascism. That's what Trumpism has become. America's homegrown brand of fascism, dressed up in the garb of Christian nationalism. I believe I could convince at least some of you of this painful truth, if only I could get you to look at the evidence. For years, I have begged you repeatedly to watch the hearings of the House Committee on the January 6th attacks, but not one of you has had the courage to do it. Now, this tells me that at some unconscious level, you already suspect the truth about Trump. Some part of you knows he is a liar, a braggart, and a coward, a weak, selfish little man who cheated on his wives and conned you into following him. I cannot force you to face that reality. But if I could, I would have you watch day 4 of the January 6th committee hearings. There you would meet Rusty Bowers, Republican Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, whom Trump tried to enlist in his illegal effort to overturn the 2020 presidential vote in that state. Bowers refused, putting his loyalty to the Constitution above his loyalty to Donald Trump, explaining during the hearing that he didn't want to win by cheating. For sticking to his conservative principles, Bowers and his family were harassed and threatened by armed Trump protesters outside their home at a time when he and his wife were caring for their daughter who was dying of cancer.
Wow.
That's the movement you belong to. You would also meet Shay Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, election workers in Georgia whom Trump had slandered with false accusations of election fraud. For their courage and dedication, Moss and Freeman were hounded out of their home by death threats from Trumpist thugs. And why not? Death threats had worked well for them before. How death threats get Republicans to fall in line behind Trump. This article in Vox tells that story in detail. As you may recall, Trump was impeached in 2019 for extortion, then again in 2021 for his role in the Capitol insurrection. In both cases, the essence of the charge was abusing the power of his office for personal political gain. Critical Republican senators voted against conviction, not because they thought Trump was innocent, but because they had received death threats against themselves and their families.
No.
Like I said, fascism is the use of violence and threats of violence to cling to power. Trump is now charged with serious felonies, not because an imaginary deep state is out to get him, not because Joe Biden fears him as a candidate,
Right.
but because the evidence against Trump is overwhelming. You say you love your country, but if you can't spare an hour or two of your time to watch day 4 of the hearings, if you can't find the courage to face the truth about Trump and your role in enabling him, then you have no right to call yourselves patriots. I beg you to find that courage and watch day 4. Be a real patriot, America needs you in her hour of peril. Sincerely, your friend Jack. Now, sadly, few, if any, Trumpists are going to accept my challenge and watch the hearings.
Right.
In fact, this image from 2016 kind of illustrates our predicament here in 2024. If Trump wins the presidency again, he will likely drag his loyal followers, along with the rest of us, into the abyss of fascism. Which brings us to part 2. By what mysterious superpower does Trump control the minds of his followers? Now, one answer you've probably heard is that Trumpism is a cult. But that merely rephrases the question. What is a cult? Why are humans prone to cultish behavior? And what is it about Trump that makes him appealing as a cult leader? Well, I think science can help us here. I suggest that Trump's vast narcissism, once considered by many a fatal weakness, is in fact his superpower and a critical clue to the mystery of cults. So, what is narcissism? As you probably know, the word comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus, a handsome young man who was so entranced by his reflection that he died of an overdose of self-love. In reality, of course, it's more complicated. And in extreme cases, psychiatrists call it narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. I have known people with NPD all my life, and you probably have too, because it's fairly common. But I did not learn the psychiatric name for it until 2009, when I interviewed a cult survivor, Carol Shelton, as part of the research for my first book.
Wow.
Carol was born into a cult. Her father, L.R. Shelton, was a Baptist preacher whose behavior was so extreme and abusive that he was eventually excommunicated from the Southern Baptist Convention.
Wow.
He ruled his congregation with an iron fist, ostracizing anyone who showed the slightest disloyalty, and he demanded extraordinary sacrifices from his followers.
Wow.
Carol's story inspired me to look up her father's symptoms in the psychiatrist manual. And that was my first clue to a dark but fascinating aspect of human nature. At the time, I also read a bunch of memoirs from other cult survivors, and each of them described similar symptoms in their leader, symptoms that all fit the pattern of NPD. So what exactly are those symptoms? I'm just going to list them. Charismatic, domineering, projecting confidence. Insatiable craving for attention and admiration. Grandiose sense of importance, achievement, and entitlement. Boasting and pathological lying. Impulsive and self-indulgent, lack of self-control. Cruelty, exploitation of others, lack of empathy. Demanding costly sacrifice as proof of devotion. Fits of rage when demands are not met, and shallow and unstable relationships, and finally, secret feelings of insecurity, shame, and humiliation. Interestingly, Yahweh checks all the boxes.
Yes, he does. Yes.
Absolutely. For the three of them, grandiosity, attention-seeking, and secret feelings of insecurity, all you need to do is look at the first 3 commandments, which are all about massaging God's fragile ego.
Yes.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not bow down to any graven image, for I am a jealous God. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, and so on. The Bible is just full of examples like these. In my books, I argue that cruel, grandiose, thin-skinned gods like Yahweh were probably modeled after narcissistic tribal leaders of antiquity. And the roots of human narcissism probably go much farther back in time than that. There are striking parallels between NPD and humans and the behavior of alpha males in our closest non-human cousins, the apes. Here's how E.O. Wilson describes it. True to their primate heritage, people are easily seduced by confident, charismatic leaders, especially males. That predisposition is strongest in religious organizations. Cults form around such leaders. Their power grows if they can persuasively claim special access to the supremely dominant, typically male figure of God. Now, this suggests that NPD isn't really a disorder at all, but is somehow adaptive, something that evolution has selected for in humans and in our distant primate ancestors.
Interesting.
After all, alpha male chimps have the best access to mates and other resources needed for reproductive success. Human narcissists often do well too. Their craving for attention may lead them into careers like acting, preaching, or politics, where they often excel. Their confident, charismatic facade makes them attractive as business leaders and lovers. Their marriages might not last, but they may have many of them, and typically many affairs on the side. So, is NPD a bug or a feature? Well, one important clue is that NPD is fairly common. This study of 34,000 American adults found that 6.2% had NPD at some time in their lives, with significantly higher prevalence among men than women. This is about 10 times greater than the lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia. And although many of the subjects had NPD only as adolescents, the data suggest that for at least half of NPD subjects, the condition is severe and lasts a lifetime.
Is that something that can cure itself, or do they know why it emerges and disappears?
In those cases where it's just sort of temporary in adolescence, I don't think that the answer to that question is really known.
Got it.
But the other part, the ones who have it for a lifetime, they seem to be incorrigible.
Right. Absolutely.
They're almost hopeless, really.
Right.
Part of the reason they're hopeless, this is kind of an aside, is that they don't see anything wrong with their behavior.
That's the tough part, is you're like, how do you, although I will say, and I've had this theory for a long time and I've tested it now, when you put two people like that in the same room together, they will complain about each other doing the exact same thing they do and truly not understand the irony. They will legitimately, they'll say, oh, that person complains way too much. They're too bossy, when all they do is complain and act bossy. It's wild how much they don't like being treated the way they treat people.
Yes, they're very good at projection too.
Yes.
So there's another clue about where NPD comes from. It turns out that narcissism is significantly heritable. In this twin study of 175 twin pairs, they examined 18 dimensions of personality disorder, and of those, narcissism was the most heritable, with 64% of the variance in this trait coming from genetic factors. So it looks like NPD is partly a product of evolution, but there's still a deep puzzle here. If NPD contributes to reproductive success, why are we not all narcissists? And if it is not an adaptation, then why does it persist at such high prevalence? Well, the answer to this may lie in a subtle facet of evolutionary theory called frequency-dependent selection, which in this case is just a fancy way of saying too many chiefs and not enough Indians. This is kind of harking back to your example of two narcissists talking to each other.
Yes.
Being a malignant narcissist pays off in evolutionary terms only if there are enough people around who are willing to be seduced by your charisma, submit to your dominance, and make sacrifices to prove their loyalty. It just doesn't work if everyone is a narcissist, or even if most people are. Now, it also doesn't work if we have all Indians and no chiefs. Evolution appears to be selecting for both, but only in the right proportion. Few leaders and many followers. This means that the narcissistic personality is only half the story of the cult phenomenon. The other half is a complementary personality type, the kind of person who is easily seduced into following a narcissist. So let's turn our attention to them. From my reading of the literature on cults, the people most vulnerable to narcissistic leaders share at least 3 important personality traits: a powerful need to belong, fear of ostracism, and willingness to sacrifice for a cause greater than themselves. Now, if I'm right about this idea that evolution has selected for these distinct leader and follower types as the basis for human tribal behavior, then we should expect that these follower traits, like the narcissistic ones, to be significantly heritable. And twin studies show that they are. For the need to belong, about 48% of the variance across individuals comes from genetic factors. Likewise, for fear of ostracism, and for self-sacrifice, measured as a willingness to be an organ donor, the heritability is about 64%.
Interesting.
So evolution has shaped human nature to make narcissistic people appealing as leaders. More specifically, it has sprinkled genes across our population in such a way that a few of us have a heritable tendency to be such leaders, while many more have a heritable tendency to fall under their spell. Now, I've been using images of Jim Jones and his followers to illustrate this part of the talk because Jonestown is the epitome of a dangerous cult. And Jones could easily have been a poster child for narcissistic personality disorder.
Right.
But of course, the same is true of Donald Trump and his cultish following.
Yes.
In fact, because of their much greater numbers, the Trumpist cult is potentially far more dangerous than Jonestown, though in a different way. In this case, it's our democracy that is at risk of self-destruction. And I am not the only one pointing this out. Many psychiatrists, psychologists, cult experts, former Trump associates, and even his niece have raised this alarm.
Wow.
In any form of cultish tribalism, the narcissism of the leader warps the minds of the followers like a hallucinogenic drug. This behavioral dynamic has been deeply carved into human nature by evolution, which explains why hardcore Trumpists are so resistant to reason and evidence. For example, recent polls show that about a third of American adults still believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen through massive voter fraud. That's a dangerously large minority, especially in a country where a minority of voters is sometimes all it takes to put a candidate into the White House. And that brings us to part 3. What's broken in our electoral system that enabled the rise of Trumpism, and how can we fix it? There are many defects in our electoral system. Here's a partial list. The Electoral College, winner-take-all single-seat congressional districts, gerrymandering of congressional districts, the Senate filibuster, corruption in general, and Citizens United decision in particular, low voter turnout, voter suppression laws, the Supreme Court nomination process, and the astonishing fact that only one person nominates a vice president.
I didn't know that.
It's just habitual. We hardly think about it. It just seems standard. But, a great many vice presidents go on to be president. So
I never thought about that.
It's a critical decision. More than one person should be involved in that nomination.
Absolutely.
process. So anyway, all of these problems that I've listed here need fixing. But in this talk, I only have time to discuss one, and it's one that's not even in this list. I think the primary defect in American democracy is the primary system. It's so defective that in some of my talks and articles, I have argued that it should be abolished. But I realize that reform is best done incrementally. And if the right reforms are made, primaries can be safely used as a means for each party to select its nominees. The critical thing is that successfully reforming the primary system requires a complementary reform of the general election. I'll explain what I mean by that later. But before you can understand the fixes, you need to understand the defects. So let's start with congressional primaries. What's wrong with those? First, they get low turnout, 20 to 30% of eligible adults, compared to 50 to 55% in general elections. Also, that low turnout is not a representative sample. They are more ideologically extreme than the general electorate. This polarizes parties and politicians, and so makes incumbents fear a primary challenge more than they fear losing the general election. And that fear of being primaried means that a charismatic president like Donald Trump can control representatives and senators simply by threatening to endorse primary challengers. And we saw that again and again during the Trump presidency. Primaries cause problems at all levels of government. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to concentrate only on presidential primaries because they are the worst. They're the most dangerous because the presidency is such a powerful office and because anyone can play. In the last 2 presidential elections, there were 6 candidates who had never run for public office, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Now, in my judgment, they were all unqualified, and at least one was temperamentally unfit. As in other primaries, in presidential ones, voters are few and ideologically extreme. But this problem is far worse in the presidential primaries because of the staggered primary schedule shown on this map. The darker the color, the earlier, and therefore the more influential, the primary or caucus. The final outcome is therefore mostly determined by a small and unrepresentative sample of voters in only a few early primary states.
Wow.
But it gets even worse. Even within this tiny set of voters, our system ignores the will of the majority of them because it uses first-past-the-post voting to winnow a large field of contenders. Now, you've probably heard the first 3 criticisms in this list, but maybe not this last one. It's really a math problem, and math problems don't often make the news, but this one should, because first-past-the-post voting gives the wrong answer. It's like hitting the plus key on a pocket calculator when you meant to press square root. It just gives the wrong answer. Now, as you might know, the term first past the post comes from an intuitively appealing but incorrect analogy we often apply to elections, namely the horse race. How do we decide which horse is faster? We line them up, we run a race, and the first one past the finish line is the winner. How do we pick or decide which candidate is preferred by the voters? Well, we ask the voters to pick their favorite, and the one with the most votes wins. The analogy is deceptively appealing because if we only have 2 candidates, it actually gives the right answer. Unless the vote is an exact tie, one candidate will get more than 50% and so represents the will of the majority. But what if we have more than 2 contenders? For the horse race problem, first past the post still gives the right answer. The first one past the finish line really is the fastest horse. But for the voting problem, it absolutely does not give the right answer. It only tells you which candidate gets a plurality of first choice votes. This would be the right answer if and only if every voter had one favorite candidate and no preference whatsoever among the remaining contenders.
Wow.
An absurd assumption that never applies in reality.
Wild.
In the real world, the plurality winner is not necessarily the candidate who is most preferred by the majority of voters. And the problem is that when you have more than 2 candidates, first past the post voting does not take in enough information from the voters to determine which candidate they truly prefer. Now, to illustrate this, I'd like to go back to a critical moment in history that's relevant to our time. Germany in 1932. In July of that year, Germans held their parliamentary elections. In Weimar Germany, people did not vote for specific representatives. Instead, they voted for their favorite political party. So this was first past the post voting at the level of parties, of which there were many. And here's the result. The Nazi Party won a plurality, a little over 1/3 of the seats. And why did they stand out like this in such a large field of contenders? Because of Hitler's confident, charismatic, and narcissistic appeal. Among a significant minority, he was an object of cult worship. And in first past the post voting with this many contenders, you only need to stand out a little bit to win. Nearly 2/3 voted against him, but they had no way to specify on their ballots which party most of them, as a group, would have preferred to the Nazis.
Interesting.
It was this defective election that made Hitler's rise to the chancellorship possible. So, how can we avoid that fate? Or to put it another way, What is the mathematically correct way to decide an election with more than 2 contenders? Well, it turns out this problem was solved in 1785 by French mathematician Nicolas de Condorcet, and the essence of it is just 2 simple steps. Step 1, convert the multi-candidate contest into a series of 2-candidate contests. For example, here's a 4-way contest among 4 candidates, Grant, Jones, Lee, and Smith. For simplicity, I will just represent them by their initials. There are 6 possible pairings of any 4 things, so our 4-way race becomes 6 pairwise contests. Now, the reason for doing this, of course, is that a 2-way race is unambiguous. The winner clearly represents the will of the majority. So next, we have to combine in some way the results of these pairwise contests, and that's step 2. The candidate who defeats all other contenders in pairwise contests wins the election. This is called the Condorcet criterion, and the candidate who satisfies it is called the Condorcet candidate or the Condorcet winner. Now, this is mathematically precise and intuitively clear. If you defeat all other candidates in pairwise contests with each of them, then you really are preferred by the majority of voters, and you truly deserve to win.
Interesting. So this would be a setup like we would vote multiple times, and each time we voted, it would be 2 totally separate sets of people, and then those people would graduate towards the next election and the next election, similar to, I think, the way sports do it with like football and basketball.
You can think of it that way, and it's easiest to understand it that way.
Yeah.
So yes, in principle, it is that way, but we will soon see that doing it that way doesn't work, and I'll get to that in just a second. Right now, I just want to emphasize the importance of this particular slide. How should we decide an election with more than 2 contenders? The Condorcet method. I want everyone watching this to burn that answer into your cortex. This could save our democracy someday if we have the wisdom to implement it. There is, however, one little fly in the ointment. Actually 2, but we'll start with this. We'll start with this one.
Okay.
You've already alluded to the second one.
Got it.
What if no candidate satisfies the Condorcet criterion? It's possible that no candidate will win all of his or her pairwise contests. Well, luckily, in real-world elections, where candidates and voters align themselves on a political spectrum, this will rarely happen. And when it does, we can find an almost Condorcet candidate, the one who comes closest to meeting the criterion. But there is another potential problem, and this is the one we were talking about a second ago. What if we have too many candidates? In principle, the number of pairwise comparisons we need to make is proportional to the square of the total number of candidates. So it looks like we need to run a lot of pairwise elections if we have more than just a few candidates. Here's a real-world example of 17 candidates. This is the Republican primary field of 2016. For simplicity, I will just represent them by the first 17 letters of the alphabet. To convert this 17-way contest into multiple pairwise contests requires 136 distinct pairs.
Whoa.
So obviously, running that many pairwise elections would be a logistical nightmare. Luckily, however, we don't need to. We can do the mathematical equivalent in a much simpler way and in one election, but only if we collect enough information from the voters on their ballots. And here is what that ballot looks like. A ranked choice ballot collects all the information we need. In any race involving more than 2 candidates, the ballot should ask the voter to rank all candidates from most to least preferred. And here's an example of how one voter might fill it in. The main point here is that this tells us how the voter would have voted if we had run all possible pairwise elections involving these candidates. Here again are those same 6 pairings now listed vertically. And for the first pair, Grant versus Jones, the voter prefers Jones in second place, now shown in red, to Grant in third place, now shown in blue. So Jones gets the vote, now shown in the tally on the right. And you can simply read each of the voters' pairwise preferences in exactly this way directly from the ballot. I'll just quickly run through them. Here's Grant versus Lee, Grant versus Smith, Jones versus Lee, Jones versus Smith, and Lee versus Smith. Now imagine repeating this process for thousands of ballots, each time adding to the pairwise counts in these two columns. The result might look something like this. If you study this for a while, you'll notice that one candidate wins all three of his pairwise contests. That candidate is Smith. Smith beats Grant, Smith beats Jones, and Smith beats Lee. And I have to point out here that I made these slides before the infamous slapping incident at the Oscars.
Oh, no.
So you'll just have to imagine that most of these voters saw Men in Black, but not the Oscar ceremony.
Right.
So Smith, in our example, is the Condorcet winner, the one who truly is the candidate preferred by the majority of voters. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, now, wait a minute. I have heard about ranked choice voting. That's not how it works. Nobody says anything about breaking it up into pairwise contests. You're supposed to be doing a series of instant runoff elections. So whatever happened to instant runoff voting, or IRV as it is sometimes abbreviated? Well, first, let's get our terminology straight. Strictly speaking, ranked choice voting refers only to the structure of the ballot. Once you have a stack of ranked choice ballots, there are many different ways to choose a winner from among them. Instant runoff is the most popular way to do ranked choice voting, but only one of many and not the best. Its greatest strength, and the reason it's so popular, is a psychological one. It's popular because it seems familiar. Voters understand runoff elections. But that's also its greatest weakness. In instant runoff, no candidate wins a majority of first choice votes. If no candidate wins a majority of first choice votes, then the candidate with the fewest first choice votes gets rejected, and candidates ranked below him on the ballots all move up to take his place. And you just keep repeating this process. So when it rejects a candidate, instant runoff ignores most of the information on the ballots because it ignores everything below the first rank. For that reason, instant runoff is not guaranteed to find the Condorcet winner, although in practice it usually does. Now, another problem is that instant runoff does not allow tied rankings on the ballot. So any ballots marked that way have to be rejected as invalid. Now that, in my view, is a serious defect.
Right.
For these and other reasons, instant runoff is not a robust voting algorithm. And that's why many experts advocate the Condorcet method. Now, in saying the word method singular, I've glossed over an important detail. It turns out there are many different Condorcet methods for ranked choice voting. Here, for example, are 4 excellent ones, my personal favorites, each with advantages and disadvantages. All of them are guaranteed to find the Condorcet winner when there is one, which of course is most of the time. Mathematically, they differ mainly in how they cope with those rare situations in which there is not a Condorcet winner. So those mathematical differences are relatively unimportant. Far more important, though, is the psychological factor I was just talking about. Can voters understand it? Now, by that criterion, one of these 4 stands out as a clear winner, and that takes us back to my chance encounter with Danny Kleinman. Danny and I became online pen pals because of an article I wrote about electoral reform. He sent me one of his articles in reply. Back in the 1950s, when he was studying math at Oberlin College, the Student Election Committee sought Danny's advice on running elections, and this led him into the mathematics of voting. He quickly saw glaring defects in the most popular methods like instant runoff and decided there had to be a better way. He derived his own voting algorithm from scratch, which he called SUM, an acronym for Single Office Majority Election. The word majority is there to emphasize that SUM is a Condorcet method. It respects the will of the majority. And as Condorcet methods go, SUM is relatively simple. It avoids all those separate tallies of pairwise contests we were doing earlier. It has other nice properties too, but I want to emphasize the psychological one. Some is easy for voters to grasp, at least as easy as instant runoff. I'll explain why in just a minute, but first, I need to explain why I'm going to stop calling it some. Decades after Danny worked it out, he discovered that an Australian astronomer and mathematician, Joseph M. Baldwin, had invented and published the identical algorithm in 1926. So to give credit where it's due, I will call it the Baldwin method, but I still give credit to Danny for opening my eyes and my mind to new ideas on electoral reform. So here's why the Baldwin method is easy for voters to grasp. First, it does repeated elimination of candidates like instant runoff, so it feels familiar. Voters know what a runoff election is. Unlike instant runoff, however, the Baldwin method always eliminates the least relevant candidate, the one who is ranked lowest on average, and voters can understand the virtue of doing that. By contrast, instant runoff sometimes rejects the most relevant candidate, the Condorcet winner. Now that's rare, but it has happened in real elections. And the reason it can happen is that when it's picking a candidate to reject, instant runoff ignores all information on the ballots other than the first choice votes. If, for example, someone in the second place rank got a large number of second place votes, that could very easily and often is the Condorcet winner, but in some circumstances, instant runoff will toss that candidate. So that's a serious problem. Now, to see how the Baldwin method works in detail, let's return to our previous example. Grant, Jones, Lee, and Smith. Here again is the first ballot. And rather than worry about pairwise contests, as we did a few minutes ago, Baldwin gives each candidate a score that indicates how preferred the candidate is relative to others. A larger score means more preferred. Specifically, a candidate's score is simply the number of contenders ranked below him. Here I've listed the candidates in order by this particular voter's preference, from most preferred at the top to least preferred at the bottom. And I'm going to put the scores on the right here. There are 3 candidates ranked below Smith, so Smith gets a score of 3. There are 2 candidates below Jones, so Jones gets a 2. There's 1 candidate below Grant, so Grant gets a 1, and no one is below below Lee, so Lee gets a 0. And yes, it really is that simple. Now, let's start a tally on the right, where I have listed the candidates alphabetically. And over here to the right of that, I'm going to add up the scores from all the ballots. And we'll also keep a count of the ballots up at the top. Okay, so let's add the numbers from the first ballot, shown here in red. We do the arithmetic, and we're done with that first ballot. Here's another one. This one's a little bit different. Notice that Grant and Jones are tied for second place, as I've emphasized in green. Again, I've listed them in order by this voter's preference, but now Grant and Jones are on the same line because they're tied. And by the way, if we were using instant runoff, we would have to discard this ballot because of that tie. But we're using Baldwin, so let's keep going and do the scores. Smith has 3 candidates below him, so he gets a 3. Grant and Jones have 1 candidate below them, so they each get a 1 for that. But a draw is better than a loss, so each tied candidate should get a little extra credit for not being defeated by the others in the tie. And the way we handle that is to give each tied candidate an extra ½ point for every other candidate in the tie. So Jones gets an extra ½ point for being tied with Grant, and Grant gets an extra ½ point for being tied with Jones.
Wow.
Now, again, nobody is below Lee, so as before, he gets a 0. We put those numbers over here on the right and add them into our totals, and we do the arithmetic. Now we're finished with 2 ballots. So just imagine continuing that process for thousands of ballots, and the tallies on the right might end up looking something like this. Now, at this point, you might be tempted to pick the highest scoring candidate as our winner, but it turns out that he is not guaranteed to be the Condorcet winner. All we know with mathematical certainty is that the Condorcet winner must have a higher than average score, and so cannot be the lowest scoring candidate. So we eliminate Lee at this point because he has the lowest score. He cannot possibly be the Condorcet winner we're looking for. And notice that all of the information from all of the ballots has gone into this decision because that's the way Lee's score was calculated. Okay, so now Lee is gone and the tally on the right has been reset to all zeros. We're going to do the same thing again, only this time we're going to ignore Lee because he's been eliminated. We just repeat this process with all the remaining candidates. And we go through all the ballots, add up all the scores on the right again, and then we will eliminate the next candidate with the lowest total score. To save some time, I'm just going to skip ahead to the end of the last cycle when only 2 remain. After that final cycle, Jones has the lower score and has been and is eliminated, and that leaves our last candidate who is guaranteed to be the Condorcet winner if there is one. And if there isn't, this last surviving one is arguably the one closest to meeting the Condorcet criteria.
So why do you think it hasn't been possible yet to just do a baseline, everybody votes for one of 2 people, there's no additional steps or layers or electoral colleges? Why can't we literally just each submit our vote and they just count our raw votes?
Yeah, exactly. If we just did that,
right?
Forget about all of the wonderful algorithms I've been showing you. If we just got rid of the electoral college and decided the election by popular vote, that would solve a lot of problems right there. It wouldn't solve all the problems.
Right.
We'd still have this, first past the post problem of picking the plurality winner who might not be anywhere close to the preferred candidate. The more candidates you have, the more problems, the more severe that problem gets.
Right.
But you're quite right. If we just got rid of the electoral college,
that
would go a long way towards helping us out of this mess.
Well, I was thinking, now is, this might have been very complicated to do in the past, but nowadays we could narrow down from the group of, say, 20 people that are running for president via text message. We could literally just on November 7th, we all text, we get a text message between these 2. Who do you like best? Tap between these. We could take care of that in one day and knock it down to the top, say, 4 or 5. And so I don't know, I'm curious why they don't utilize stuff like that more often.
That's a great question. I don't have time to deal with that one in this talk,
you're like, that's not my job. I don't know.
But it is. I mean, it's one of the most important ones. There's a lot of history behind it, obviously.
Right.
We're carrying a lot of historical baggage in our electoral system, and we really need to clean it up.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it's good that you stepped in here with those comments and questions, because I'm just at the point now where I'm going to make a big transition. I've kind of buried you and the audience in mathematical details.
No, everybody's talking in the chat about how much they're learning from this. So thank you for sharing this information with us.
At this point, we are ready to step back a little bit and look at the big picture again. So here's the big picture question. For example, would the Baldwin method have saved Germany in 1932 if they had had direct election of the chancellor using ranked choice ballots and a robust voting method like Baldwin, even with their 15 different parties or whatever it was? Would Hitler have lost using if the Baldwin method was being used? My guess is probably yes, but we'll never know for sure. All we know is that the Nazis never won a majority of the vote in any of the 5 big elections that were held that year. So Baldwin might very well have saved the day. But of course, what we really care about is here and now. What electoral reforms would save American democracy now? What system would best protect us from narcissistic demagogues? Well, experts disagree, but here's what I suggest. Abolish staggered presidential primaries.
Yes.
But remember, this doesn't necessarily mean abolishing primaries altogether. We could, for example, have a single nationwide primary. Next, use the Baldwin method to choose the president in the general election. Now, doing that also abolishes the Electoral College, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, that requires a constitutional amendment, which means that none of this will happen anytime soon. But rather than give up in despair, let's return to my list of conservative virtues for some inspiration. Specifically this one, making big changes in small steps to avoid big mistakes. Essentially, this is the gradualism of 18th century British conservative Edmund Burke. But it's also a lesson from biological evolution. Big changes are best made in small steps. That's what evolution does. We should use that strategy in pursuing electoral reform because it's the best way to overcome big obstacles. For example, there's a really helpful first step we could take that does not require a constitutional amendment, and I've already alluded to it. We could replace our staggered presidential primaries with one national primary that uses the Baldwin method. Now, of course, there would still be problems with this, like the Electoral College, which would still be there affecting the general election. But there would also be real improvements. Turnout would probably be much greater and more representative than in our current staggered primary system, which means that moderate candidates would be more likely to win and polarization might start to decline. Also, more voters would learn the new system. They'd get to vote for minor party candidates without worrying about wasting their votes. And they could imagine what it would be like to abolish the Electoral College and use this method for the general election. And best of all, narcissistic demagogues would probably lose because for whatever reason, their hardcore following tends to be only about a third of the population, at least in the examples we've been talking about in this talk. Now, maybe we can thank frequency-dependent selection for that. I don't know. But in any case, I think a nationwide primary of this kind is a compelling and realistic near-term goal. But sadly, it's not near-term enough to help us in 2024. And that brings us to part 4, my urgent plea for help, cast in the form of an open letter to my anti-Trump friends. Like me, you love America and you know Trump doesn't. You know a narcissistic bully when you see one, and you know he cares only about himself. Most of us would crawl over broken glass to vote against Donald Trump. I assure you I certainly would, and I urge you to do exactly that. But be sure to crawl in the right direction. The broken glass may take many forms, some obvious, others subtle. You may be sick of inflation, disappointed with Biden, or think he's too old. You might be tempted by some minor party candidate who really inspires you. As election day approaches, you may see that Trump is behind in the polls and feel that your vote doesn't even matter. On election day, the weather might suck, or you need to work overtime, or you have the flu. Whatever the obstacle, you must overcome it. As I write these lines, the primaries are just beginning. We don't yet know who the presidential candidates will be in November. But if Donald Trump is one of them, as now seems likely, you must vote strategically to defeat him, even if that means not voting for your favorite candidate. If you live in any state other than Maine and Alaska, remember that first past the post voting will be used in 2024. Someday, with dedication and hard work, you can help abolish this broken system and replace it with something better. But for now, you must vote for the leading opposition candidate, the one with the best chance of beating Donald Trump, even if he or she is not your favorite. To do this, you must study the most reliable polls just before the election to find that leading opposition candidate. If present trends continue, we're going to have a Biden-Trump rematch, and that candidate will probably be Joe Biden. But if you live in Maine or Alaska, you will be voting for president, excuse me, using ranked choice ballots with instant runoff. So here you can vote honestly rather than strategically, but you still need to be careful because of the problems with instant runoff. Rank all candidates, including those from minor parties, by your true preferences, but be absolutely sure to rank Trump last. Don't just leave him unranked. Also, be careful to avoid tied rankings anywhere on your ballot. A voting machine should prevent that blunder, but a paper ballot will not. But above all, you must vote. Use a mail-in ballot if that would help. Vote early if your state allows it. Do whatever it takes. If Donald Trump is on the ballot in November, then America faces a dire emergency. The House is on fire. We don't have the luxury of protest votes from minor party candidates, or refusing to vote at all because no candidate appeals. Even if you're a traditionally conservative Republican who is disillusioned with Trump, but also hates the idea of voting for a Democrat, remember the lesson of Germany's 1932 election. If Trump wins a second term as president, this may be the end of our democracy and possibly the last presidential election we will ever have. Sincerely, your friend Jack. Now, I know that was a somber message, so I'm going to try to leave you with a few points of encouragement. We can get there from here.
Absolutely.
Don't be dismayed by obstacles to electoral reform. It won't all happen overnight, but there are realistic steps we can take that lead to a more robust and fair electoral system. Remember, big changes are best done in small steps. As a nation, we need to have a serious conversation about electoral reform. We cannot allow something like this to happen again. If creeping fascism worries you, as it should, then do something about it. You can help. Vote strategically this November. Then write to your representatives and party leaders demanding reform, starting with a single nationwide primary election using some form of ranked choice voting. While you're at it, write your state representatives and demand ranked choice voting in statewide presidential elections, as in Maine and Alaska. Now, if you'd like to learn more, I've written several essays on this subject, which you can find at my website. For more information about the importance of using a Condorcet method, I recommend this website at Princeton University. And to push for ranked choice voting at the local level, contact fairvoteaction.org. And with that, I'll be happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Awesome.
Give me just a second to stop sharing here.
Yep, I just took it down off the screen for you.
Okay, great.
Perfect. Great. That was awesome. Thank you so much for that really important information. The chat was popping off about ways they agree, ideas they had, all sorts of conversation going on. And so I have some questions here for you.
Sure.
The first one was one that I wrote down while you were talking. And in the beginning, when you were talking about the basically, for lack of a better term, the brainwashing of people that are involved in these cult-like obsessions, like Trump fans and things like that, would you suggest that we treat people that we know, say, for example, to be obsessed with Donald Trump, should we treat them the same way that we might treat a cult survivor, with that kind of empathy and understanding? Or is it better for in those situations to negate those ideas? How to not be basically an enabler for people like that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Like I said, I have struggled with that for these last 8 years, and I consider myself a failure. I'm probably not the best person to ask. I try to be empathetic. I try to be patient.
Right.
I tried to express some of that in the letter, my open letter.
Right.
But I also feel you have to tell them the truth at some point. You have to be honest. They have to face reality.
Right. Absolutely.
I'm not sure I know the best way to do it.
Right. And the sad part is a lot of them think they are facing reality. They believe that that is reality. And it's unreal to watch it happen, especially when it's people you care about.
Yeah. I should mention at this point, there's a big facet of this that I have not talked about because I just didn't have time to mention it. But Hitler did this. The Nazis did it superbly. It's the problem of propaganda. It's not just the cultishness, the innate drive to sort of worship the narcissistic leader. You can be walled off from reality by a propaganda machine. In Nazi Germany, they had a police state. They controlled all the media. It really was a propaganda machine. Here, we don't have that, but at least not enforced by the government. Sadly, we have it enforced by economics, because Fox News discovered that they could win themselves a great market share just by telling right-wingers what they want to hear, whether it's true or not.
Right.
So they have become this right-wing propaganda machine, and they have imitators on, the internet, and it just snowballs, and people can wall themselves off from reality in these propaganda machines.
Right. I'll never forget one day I was at a gym, and they had TVs across the front of the room, and on 2 TVs, they had Fox on one and they had CNN on another, and they were using the exact same clip of Joe Biden, the same clip to a T, cut off at the same points. And on the CNN side, it said, Biden announces potential changes and reforms to some program that he was considering. And then on the Fox News one, it said Trump slashes this, and Trump cuts that, or not Trump, Biden like slashes this and destroys this, and Biden says no more. And the clip was not him saying no more, I'm going to cut this. It was wild that, but with both headlines, the clip looked like what they were both talking about. It was very interesting. And so I don't know if you've ever seen those videos where it's so-and-so destroys so-and-so. Whoever's on whoever's side is going to agree that that person won. Yeah. No matter who actually won in the debate clip that you're watching, if they title it that the person you like won, you're going to watch it and go, I don't really understand what happened, but it looks like he won. So I'm just going to say that he won in this clip. It's wild how that's all they have to do is put the right headline and colors and music, and the same exact clips can both scare you or be what you agree with or disagree with. It's wild.
Yeah.
So Carrie Ann asks, what would it take to make a Congress independent from all others for each of the departments of federal government, potentially a president for each as well, to guarantee checks and balances?
That's an interesting question.
That is.
I have never thought of that. That's a different way of doing separation of powers than our founders thought of. But it's a fascinating thought. I don't know. I don't know. I'll have to sleep on that one. I really need to think about that one. To me, just my first impression of that is that it seems to add so much complexity that it would be hard to get there. That you might have to go through many steps to get to that. Whether it would be the best system in the long run, I don't know.
We should vote for Carrie in November. Carrie Ann, that was a great idea. Yeah. And then while you were talking about the Condorcet elections, Pragmatic Crystal wanted to know who would enforce it, or who would you recommend enforce that?
The Condorcet method?
Yeah. So if we were to implement it in the United States, who do you think would be put in charge of that?
Well, first of all, if you mean who would, or if the question is at what level of government would this have to happen? For the presidential election, it would have to happen as a constitutional amendment. At some point, you would need a constitutional amendment to get rid of the garbage we already have, the Electoral College and all of that. But I gather, or at least I suspect, that your question might be not that, but how do we make sure at the local level, where votes are actually being counted, that it's being done honestly and correctly, properly, and not cheating, or not even just honest error happening, because it seems kind of complicated. Well, the Baldwin method, in fact, just about any of these ranked choice voting methods, is more complicated than plurality voting. But we need that complexity because the problem we're trying to solve is complicated.
Right.
That's why plurality voting, or first past the post, fails miserably. So we must deal with that complexity somehow. I think the most practical way to do it, and I did not have time to go into this in the talk, but there are sort of two different ways or two different levels at which you can kind of condense the results of a ranked choice election, no matter what algorithm you're using. Instead of counting, you're not really counting votes for a particular person. What you're doing is you're counting up rankings. Each ballot has a ranking on it. So what you do is you go through the ballots and you look for rankings, say 1, 3, 5, different orders of the candidates, different unique rankings. And for each unique ranking, you count how many ballots have that particular ranking. So you end up compressing the data from this huge stack of ballots down to a much smaller stack of rankings, unique rankings, however many unique rankings occurred in the ballots that you have, and a number with each of those. And that number is the number of people who voted for that ranking. So that's the way you kind of condense the election. And you can do that at the county level, the precinct level, state level, whatever, just the way we do now with simple vote counts per person.
And
so
do you oh, sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, that kind of simplifies matters, and that much is something you could do in principle pretty much as easily as we do now, with a stack of paper ballots, people counting them. You could have a machine do a machine count of the paper ballots with optical scanners or whatever, and then you can have an audit by hand of the paper ballots. All of that would still work. And what you would get from all of that is this final tally of the list of rankings that were used, that showed up in the ballots, and the number of votes for each ranking. Then you apply the algorithm to it, either the Baldwin algorithm or instant runoff or something else. And at that stage, obviously, it's easiest to do this with a computer. A computer could do it instantly. And I suggest that that could be done in a way that's verifiable and reliable and agreed upon by everyone. If it's done with an open source program, everybody has access to the source code. Anybody can compile that on their computer and run it for themselves and see how the answer comes out. It's verifiable by anybody who has a computer. So I think that's a very practical way to do it, and I think that's kind of I think that's what the questioner was getting at anyway. That's
interesting. Yeah,
so
I think you're right.
Done.
Do you have a preference in terms of, like, is the Baldwin method what you think is the better method, or instant runoff? What would be your preferred method?
I like the Baldwin method a lot. There's another one very similar to it that I did not mention called the Nansen method. The difference between the two, I don't know if you remember, but the mathematical, you can actually prove mathematically that with these scores, these preference scores that Baldwin does, you have mathematical certainty that the Condorcet winner must have a higher than average score. So what I was doing and what I was showing you was eliminating the lowest scoring candidate one by one until you run out of candidates, and the last one left has to be the Condorcet winner. That works, and it's easy to understand. There's a slightly more subtle version of it called the Nansen method, where what you do is you figure out what the average score is and throw away everyone below the average. So
interesting.
You have a smaller number of eliminations. Otherwise, it works the same. After you throw away those below average, you do it again. You run the algorithm again with the survivors, find the new average score, throw away the ones below that average, and so on until you only have one left.
I like that method. That one seems the simplest to me.
If it might be. And this is the kind of thing I meant when I said we need to have a serious conversation about electoral reform as a nation.
Right.
We need to have people talk about these alternatives and hash out the pluses and minuses. There are, haven't even talked about the other ones in the list. The other ones are much more complex, but some would argue they do a better job in those rare situations when you don't have a Condorcet winner. I think that's relatively unimportant because it will almost never happen.
Right.
But, it's part of the conversation, and we should have that conversation.
Or maybe have like a go-to plan B on the rare occasion that you need it. We've already agreed that this will be the fallback.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Do you think, another question was, do you think that people, the same exact people who act like Trump, the people that have these personality disorders, do you think those people would vote for Trump simply to watch everything get screwed up? Do you think the same things that make them narcissistic would also drive them to do something like that they know everybody else doesn't want to happen, that they know would cause chaos, that they know would lead to mayhem? Or would that be like a different personality trait, do you think?
I think most of the Trump people I know personally are sincerely convinced that Trump is the greatest president ever, that he loves America more than anyone else, that a second Trump term would be wonderful for the country. And when they say things like this, they talk about how good the economy was under Trump, how great it's going to be in his second term.
Did they live in America during that time? I'm confused. Maybe I just missed it. I didn't see that.
Basically, I think they are mainly parroting what they hear from the propaganda machine.
Yes.
From the Fox and Friends chatter and so on. They sincerely want America to prosper and all of that. They just don't see reality. Now,
Right.
There are a few, I think, who fit the description in your question. That is someone who really is nihilistic, who just wants to tear the system down. People who are frustrated and think, oh, to hell with this. Trump is going to shake things up. Let him do it. I'm sure there are people like that.
I do remember briefly after the 2016 election, there was a poll that was done that said an astronomical number of people. It was something like 10% of voters voted for Trump because they thought it was a joke and he would never win. Like it was a large majority of Republican voters, obviously, who they genuinely thought there was such a low chance that they would just do it for the laughs, like for the
that at the time, as I'm sure you remember, all of the polls were predicting that Trump would go down to defeat, that the chance that Hillary would win was very high, and she was, they were already making detailed plans of what they were going to do on the first day, and and all of that went up in smoke because partly, not mainly, but partly because of what you just said. I'm sure there were people who said, oh, I'm just going to do a protest vote. Why not vote for Trump?
Right.
He's going to lose anyway.
And here we are.
They did not see my second letter about strategic voting and the terrible things that can happen.
Yes. Speaking of which, whenever we talk about, because I know that people, I hate to say our side and their side, but I know that people on our side talk a lot about how bad things could get if Trump won again and how it could change literally the landscape of the nation. What are some examples of things that could very realistically happen that would change things? Because it's hard for me when I'm trying to convey these to people. It's hard for me to give actual examples because it hasn't happened yet without sounding like a doomsday prepper. And so I feel like your expertise would be taken much more seriously in terms of things that maybe you think could happen, or you've seen studies that say could happen, or statistically could happen.
Yeah, well, I am glad you asked that question because I have a very easy answer. What you need to do, anybody who's curious about that, you need to get the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly. So it's their January-February issue. Covers these 2 months. You can probably still buy it. I recommend you get a subscription to it. It's a wonderful journal. But that entire issue is dedicated to answering exactly that question. All of their experts have weighed in from their different kinds of expertise on what they think was going to happen in a second Trump term. And I'll just mention a few of them. I haven't even finished reading the issue. I just got it yesterday in the mail. But one of them is, and I've heard this on the news before, it's been talked about for weeks at least, Trump has a bunch of people around him, hangers-on who are eagerly looking forward to being part of his administration. And one of the things they're planning to do is to basically fire all of the long-term civil servants in the federal government. A lot of the federal government is run by people who are not affiliated with either political party.
Wow.
They are not elected. They're hired by administrations, but they tend to work through multiple administrations. Some of them work their whole career doing things like running the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the National Institutes of Health, or, there's a whole bunch of organizations like this in the federal government. There are tens of thousands of employees who do this, and they make our government work. They're really essential workers. And Trump's plan, especially his sycophants around him, their plan is to get rid of these people and replace them with Trump loyalists so that there will be nobody to impede anything he wants to do. When he was president the first time, he was stymied again and again in his most outrageous demands by people who refused to go along with it. And his plan is to get rid of those people. So that's one thing. Another thing he has planned, I've read, is that if, because of all of these drastic draconian changes he's going to make, people like you and me go out into the streets and protest by the millions, as they were recently doing in Israel up until October 7th. He's planning to use the military. He's going to invoke the Insurrection Act and use the military, order the military to put down the protests. Now, it's a big question whether the military would go along with that, or whether some parts of the military would and others wouldn't. Do we have a police state? Do we have a civil war amongst our various factions within the military?
Right.
These kinds of things are realistic possibilities in a second Trump term.
What do you do when your own military can't agree with each other?
Yeah,
that alone can just disassemble.
So we don't know. All I can say is it's almost certainly going to be a terrible constitutional crisis. What form it will take is hard to predict, but read the Atlantic for their first issue for 2024. It's sobering reading.
Yeah, and they'll have to Google it because I tried to post a link and then it posted this like 150 character link that doesn't work. So you can find it. I've got it right here. Google it. And so somebody else asked this earlier this week, or they made this comment, and I was curious what your thoughts are. They said that they thought Reagan was a worse president than Trump. What do you think? I don't know. Do you agree? Disagree?
I disagree. I was unhappy with Reagan when he was president. I did not vote for him. But he was not in any way, shape, or form as dangerous to the democracy as Donald Trump.
Yeah.
If he had been defeated in his second election, or his first for that matter, he would have admitted it.
Yeah.
He was proud of the peaceful transition of power that is a tradition in the United States. And he, in one of his speeches, specifically praised the peaceful transition of power. He would never have done what Trump did in 2020. Right. So for that reason alone, I would say no. Sorry, Trump is way worse.
Well, and I think also, and this is me speaking from somebody who has only ever read about it. I wasn't there, but I feel like Reagan's decisions impacted individual people negatively, and Reagan's decisions hurt a lot of people on a individual household level, whereas Trump's decisions have destroyed the fabric of our democracy, which is a much different problem. Reagan, I feel like, thought he would. I don't feel like Reagan did things with the sole purpose of causing chaos.
Yeah.
He did things that he thought were correct and he agreed with, and they ended up being detrimental. Whereas I think Trump truly tried to punish his own citizens for an election that he was convinced was rigged. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel
I
like
know exactly what you're saying.
He wanted
Yes.
January 6th. He wanted to tear us apart. He wanted to cause chaos. He wanted to cause mayhem. He wanted to be in the news every day for saying crazy things. And I think that's the biggest difference between the two.
That's a great point. The extreme political polarization that we have now did not begin with Donald Trump. It was there before he was elected. But he deliberately poured gasoline on that fire. He deliberately made it worse. No other president has done that in my lifetime. I don't think ever.
Right. Absolutely. And I was talking about this not long ago, probably a year ago, where I said, do you remember when in the 90s and in the early 2000s, George Bush would see himself on Saturday Night Live and he would laugh and he would think it was funny and he would reference the skit in his next public address of some kind. And that was it. And then
because he was a normal human being.
Right. And same with Obama. Like, I remember when Obama hopped onto the Thanks Obama meme train and did that like cookie commercial, and like they could joke about it and it was no longer funny anymore after that. It was just tiresome. But well, Dr. Jack Wathey, I think that was all the questions that we had given in the chat. If you've got a couple, throw them in there real quick. But other than that, we really, really appreciate your time and your experience and your thoughts, because I think people like me who are just millennials out here with a camera and a channel can say something all day, every day, and people will go, meh, that's just a lib. But I feel like people with your background and your ability to research and your PhD and I feel like the clout that comes behind your opinion is important. And especially with somebody with lived experience like you have, I feel like your thoughts and opinions, even if they're the same as mine, have so much more weight and value, and you have the statistics to back them up, and you have the research and the experience to back them up. So we really appreciate you spending your time with us, because this has been an invaluable time. And I know in the chat they've been talking about how much they really appreciated everything you had to say, and you have a way of articulating things that we've been trying to think of a way to say, and you can articulate them, and you have statistics to back them up, and you have words that we didn't know existed to describe them. And we all just really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, of course. And for anybody in the chat, even after we end the stream, you can still contact me via the notes in whatever you're listening on or watching on. Submit an email if you have questions, if you have comments, throw them on the YouTube video. I would love to send them to Dr. Wathey after this if you think of them at a later time. I'm always collecting your questions and your thoughts and your ideas and your opinions. So please feel free to weigh in. We'd love to hear what you have to say. But other than that, I think that's all we had. So I'll see you guys later. And